Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris and welcome to another episode of Bionicle Fanon Reviews, the show where I review the fan-created, community-made Bionicle mocks, whether they be canon, semi-canon, or just non-canon or fanon. Whatever they are, I am here to review them. Now, for today's topic, we have a finalist from my Dinosaurs of Bota Magna Fanon contest. That was a really big contest that we held. I'm actually building all the finalists. You can see some of them up here, and the one on the very edge is the one we're going to be reviewing today. That is the Magna Raptor. This is an incredible model built by digital Bionicle Machas Sonova, and I will have to say, I am constantly so impressed by what Sonova does with studio, with digital builds. He is one of the most prolific Filipino LEGO designers out there. They don't have that much LEGO stock in the Philippines, so he really just works with what he has in terms of working with digital building and creates some of the most intricate and coolest Bionicle designs I have ever seen. So Sonova has been entering pretty much all these contests. This was a big win to get a finalist state for the dinosaur contest, and I was really curious to see exactly how this model would translate being built digitally into physical bricks. Thankfully, most of the pieces were pretty much already in existing colors. I did have to 3D print and resin print a few pieces on my actual custom resin printing store. You can check that out on Big Cartel, linked in the description below, but all the custom pieces you can see were just printed by myself. Everything else was just done by Sonova, the whole design and everything, and I'll have to say, for a fully digital model, I was really pleasantly surprised at how well it held up to physical play. And so, without further ado, let's sum up some of the points that we use to consider all of these Bionicle Fanon reviews, and let's go. For every Bionicle Fanon review, I rank the builds by 4 key points. Number 1 is posability. Can the model get in good poses? Can it support its own weight? And can it hold the weight of its own weapons, or is it just falling over? Number 2 is building techniques. Is the model just regurgitating stuff from existing LEGO sets, or is it trying something new and doing that well as using unique parts usages? Number 3 is overall aesthetics. How good does the model look completely agnostic of storyline relevance, and is it generally aesthetically appealing? And finally, number 4 is believability in universe, which means that does the storyline given to the model by the Bionicle story team make sense given how the model is built, and does the model scale well next to some representative samples from the Bionicle universe? And with that, let's consider these 4 points and more as we jump into a brief story and lore explanation of today's featured build. Alright, so this right here is the Magna Raptor by Sonova. This was among our top 12 finalists in the large category of the Dinosaurs of Bota Magna Fanon contest, and for starting off as an all-digital model, using parts and colors that don't exist, and just kind of trying to blend together what could be an actual physical LEGO build, this actually came together really well, and I was really pleasantly surprised and impressed by how stable this is, despite being an all-digital build. Now, specifically for this model, I did have to resin print a number of different pieces because they simply do not exist in particular colors. Namely, I resin printed the Hero Factory Brain Attack armor piece in white, I resin printed these particular add-on pieces from Bionicle Stars in white, the Nuva chest in white, and there were also a few brown pieces I had to resin print, so you've got kind of the claws on the tips of the feet there, the detail claw pieces in brown. You've also got the Galaxy Squad and minifigure wings in white. Let's see, what else do we have? We have some clip and attachment pieces in brown up here, and finally I 3D printed in plastic some gunmetal gray pieces, particularly the LEGO Elves crystals, so these are in gunmetal gray for the detail pieces on here, printed these claw pieces in gunmetal gray, but to be honest, you don't really need to do it. I mean, you could easily use black and it would have worked out just fine, and finally 3D printed the tip of the tail in silver for these kind of additional add-on spiky pieces there, neither of which exist in LEGO's metallic silver color. After all was said and done, I was actually really happy with the amount of pieces that actually I had to print. I was pretty happy with how they turned out. Oh yeah, and I also had to resin print a couple of those axle to mixel joint connectors in white as well, but pretty much everything else was just regularly used from LEGO pieces. I think, is there anything I'm missing? The worm gear in black in the middle here was also 3D printed, and I think that was actually resin printed, but I didn't really need to. I mean, the gray ones work just fine, so the black, I guess it maintains the color scheme, but for the most part, if you wanted to build this yourself without specific access to a 3D printer, I think it actually would be pretty easy. The only parts that I know you definitely would have to leave out are the Galaxy Squad wings here, because those only came came in, I believe, orange and green. I don't think they came in any other colors. So those I did have to print, which was unfortunate, but again, I can't really think of any other necessary parts. Like, there were a couple of like attachment claw pieces in brown here, but you can easily just use the white color of those pieces or whatnot. Claws could be black. You could leave off the elves crystals or use like a transparent color as a highlight color, like an orange color or something like that. You could easily use gray for the tip of the tail here instead of silver. Stuff like that where the color scheme isn't disrupted too much by just having the stuff be 3D printed. Unfortunately, as a side effect, it means that it is just a little bit more fragile than I would hope, because obviously these are all resin printed and they're not very stable compared to standard LEGO builds. I honestly was really impressed I was able to make clip pieces actually work together and be the right dimensions via resin printing. It just goes to show how accurate the technology is, I guess. But also, if you're kind of rough with it, then they will just tend to fall off, which is not a big deal. You can just kind of clip them back on. I mean, that shouldn't actually have fallen off. That should be on there pretty tight now. So thankfully, that's not a big deal. Now, standing up the model is a little bit annoying because I think this is just kind of an oversight when it comes to digital building. There is nothing actually attaching these Borak eyepieces downwards, so every time you want it to stand, you have to specifically move these claw pieces up and then put it on the ground. It's just kind of an extra step you do have to do when putting this down. It's not a huge deal, but just something I figured I would point out. And of course, like all the Bionicle fan reviews, we will start off with posability and articulation, move on to building techniques, finally talk about overall aesthetics, and lastly talk about the believability in universe. Starting off with the posability. This is a remarkably posable creature. Obviously, you can move the tail pretty much any way that you want. There isn't quite enough actual friction in the joints themselves, despite it using a friction add-on piece to keep it up all the time. If it's up all the way, this kind of works, but as soon as you want to have it like splayed outwards like this, it will just immediately droop down. So just a little bit too much weight there. There is a little bit of friction added on because of the inclusion of tires here, which are rubber tires, but honestly they don't really do that much because they're just kind of loose and they don't really affect the friction whatsoever. They do provide some filling of gaps, but that's really all they do, and for the most part that's all the kind of articulation you get for the tail. You can move it around, but it will just flop down to the ground. Now, as you saw when it was rotating around, it does not need the tail to be touching the ground to stand. I mean, it can stand just fine without the tail touching the ground. It's not an issue of posability, it's just that the tail itself is so heavy that it will just naturally fall on the ground, obviously making it more stable in the process, but doesn't really need to do that. It's just something I figured I would mention. Of course, the drill can be rotated, so you can have some sort of a kind of weapon attachment on the tail as well, which is kind of adds some extra playability to it. And moving onwards to the head is mounted on a neck here, so you can really get a full range of motion here, looking back and forth. The jaw opens and closes, which is a very, very satisfying motion to me. I love the way that the jaw actually opens and shuts on this model, and we'll talk about that a lot more when we get to building techniques, but the jaw is just so good. Moving on to the legs themselves, there is a little bit of a downside here, presumably because this was made as a digital model. Maybe it just wasn't immediately clear how the articulation of the legs would work, but you can't actually bend these like at all. Like, this is basically fixed as it is for the upper legs. You can splay them outwards and you can bend them all together. So the way it's set up is that these two hand attachment pieces are connected on the same axle. So if you want to bend or move like this back part upwards, if you see what I mean, you have to move them all at once. So you can do this like that. That moves it a little bit, but you have to do it all at once. You can't like have one leg be more forwards than the other outside of just a little bit of flex in the ball joints, just because of the connection points used here. It's a little bit unfortunate, but it is what it is. You can't really move the upper legs. Thankfully, all those problems are solved when you get to downwards on the rest of the legs, because everything else is highly posable. So you can have these parts of the legs kind of expand upwards and downwards like so. So you have a whole lot of flex here. Obviously, you can move these forwards and backwards, so you can have the semblance of a walking pose. Even if you can't really move the front of it there, this just works totally fine as is. So that is not too bad. And then overall, you can actually wiggle each one of the individual toes, which is really, really cool to see. I really appreciate that you can actually do that. Now, the toes are really built in an interesting way. My apologies, the tail keeps coming off. I don't know, I don't think that's a fault of the design. I just think it's just kind of like my pieces being somewhat loose, because it's attached by like 2 axles, so I don't know why that keeps popping off. But
if we look at the way the feet are done here, it is a really interesting construction because it's using a lot of different recolors of clip elements to give it a lot of texture in the way the feet are done. Maybe this is getting more into building techniques, but as you can see here, you actually have each of the claws which can be moved separately, so you can wiggle each of the toes here, you can move them up and down, you can move them side to side. There's a lot of different wiggle in terms of how you can play around with the tail itself. You've got the little Ben 10 add-on pieces being used in brown to add some extra texture here. Just a very interesting setup here. Obviously, I was using old brown instead of the newer reddish brown. I specifically did the older dark brown because I was just happened to have that color in my resin printer for my online resin store, so I was like, you know what, I think it'll look just fine in the old brown as well. I didn't want to mix a new reddish brown color for no reason, but for the most part, you can see that the articulation here is very good overall for the feet themselves, and it's just really satisfying to be able to move these around. Now, I think that about sums up all of the articulation we have here. There isn't too much else to say about the articulation. Again, big shame that the upper legs just simply cannot move, but it's not that big of a deal because, again, the rest of the limbs are just so posable that it honestly doesn't really matter in the long run. Now, moving on to the building techniques. This was a model that was immensely satisfying to put together, down to the details on pretty much every single surface of it. Now, the one thing I didn't notice is that I also had to 3D print gears in silver on the bottom here, although you could very easily use gray. But that's one thing I really like about it, is that you actually have these gear-like details in cascading sizes on the bottom and sides of the model, which really do give it that mechanical innards look, and that is just a really cool design to see here. Now, folding these out again. That's probably the most annoying part of making this stand up, is folding the Borak teeth out. I love the very unique and inventive construction used for the particular feet themselves. The toes are the big standouts here, with the amount of detail that Sonova managed to fit in with the Galaxy Squad wings, from minifigure pieces to the claws and whatnot. Everything just feels so organic and alive in terms of being very spiky and out there. I also really like how the transition is done between CCBS and standard Bionicle, particularly around the legs. You've got these brain attack pieces working really well in conjunction with the stringer breakout armor pieces. You've got kind of vines wrapping around it. Of course, you have some hoses and tubes snaking around the model itself, feeding into the mixture of organic and mechanical. And of course, man, when we get to the head is just so well done in the way that it's presented. So first of all, it is using some of the blade pieces introduced for Ninjago 2012 for the upper parts of the teeth here, and they just work so well in conjunction with the Hero Factory 3.0 bulk helmet, the wolf helmet here, that it almost feels like they were made to go together. It is crazy how well these work together. I never would have tried to kind of combine them together, but it is done in such a clever way, and I just love the way the head is done. The usage of the Nuva chest in white to kind of form the nostrils of the creature itself is a really smart and inspired choice. I love the usage of the antenna piece for the eyes because you really have a clear pupil being used there. Unfortunately, the building techniques mean that this is a little bit wobbly. This whole construction here isn't technically really attached or adhered on by more than just one point, so it's super wobbly, and this does just bend back and forth. There's nothing keeping the top spike in place. But when you don't touch it too much and just kind of enjoy the headpiece for what it is, it just looks really good, and I just love the way that this all comes together to have a very expressive head. You can clearly see the expressions on this creature as it's kind of looking around. It has maybe an excited expression with the mouth open, it's looking for food, it's hungry. With the mouth closed, it has a completely different demeanor to it. Maybe it's like worried or something, and then you have like an attacking pose where you've got the head tilted upwards and roaring. This is just such an expressive build, and I really like just how posable it is. It's a shame that a lot of the head is very finicky to move around with. This will kind of separate out. You've got like this, which will bend downwards on its own, this whole piece which is separately attached, and they're all just attached on like bars, so nothing's really held in that tightly together. But when it does work, it works really well, and if you don't touch it too much, it works fine as a display piece. Moving onwards to the rest of the building techniques, one thing that I really like is the usage of how specific armor pieces are used to kind of mimic how the maybe spikes would look like on the back, or kind of a repeated armor plating. The usage of the hoses being integrated into the tail itself are very, very nice parts usages here, and all in all, I'm very happy with the building techniques, my biggest complaints only being the fact that, well, the upper leg legs don't move at all, and the fact that the tail sometimes does droop a little bit. These little things are annoying to make it stand up, these like little Borak eyes on the back here. I think it could have done without these, but for the most part, this is a really impressive model, and the fact that it is as sturdy as it is, despite being a fully digital model, is definitely a sight to behold. I certainly would not have expected a fully digital model to be this stable and this posable, and yet here we are. Moving onwards from that though, I think it's time we talk about the overall aesthetics of this model, because there is actually a good amount to talk about in that regard. Outside of the Bionicle universe, I think this is just a really well done model in general, because it really does feel like a raptor, which is what it's supposed to be. Despite the fact that it doesn't have any front arms, which I guess throws me off a little bit. The proportions do feel a little bit strange to me, how large the legs are and then how small the body is in comparison. This is a fantasy creature. It doesn't need to adhere to our preconceived notions for what dinosaurs look like in media. It acts as fully its own thing, and that's something I really like. The usage of so many spikes covering different aspects of the body, like it has evolved to kind of grow these metal spikes, is a really cool touch. I like how very angular the design is, and of course the repeated usage of the Hero Factory sonic weapons piece really feels like it has some sort of character to it, and these are maybe vents or some sort of a defense system that the dinosaur can use. Moving onwards to, of course, the building techniques, and all went into making the aesthetics of the head be pretty perfect. This may be one of my favorite heads out of all of the Dinosaur Fanon contest winners. The head is just done really well, so cool to see these pieces being used in conjunction with each other, and overall I think the aesthetics of this are really good. Sure, maybe the legs are a little bit large compared to the rest of the body, which is more kind of like a small lizard-like creature, but I think it does the job fair enough for what it is, and the color scheme is very cool too. It has a very bony color scheme to it, and for kind of being this kind of creature that lurks around Bota Magna, I definitely feel that it really does add to the look and feel of this being like a predator, so you've got some exposed bone, or maybe all these are metal kind of peeking out from the exoskeleton of this creature, just making this a really fun model to put together. But with that, I think it's time to bring over some representative samples from the Bionicle universe. Here I have Akar, who is just kind of your standard Glatorian or a Nika size build, so we've got Akar here, and Ranu, who is a standard Agori size build, so let's just get him up here as well. And I think this scales fairly well next to the Glatorian and Agori. It's not egregiously oversized where it feels completely out of proportion, and it's not too small either that it doesn't feel like it would pose a threat. This feels like a creature that maybe it could be even ridden by some of the characters, and one thing I'm doing with all the reviews is trying to make at least as many as I can ride the creatures. I'm gonna have to be very gentle with this one because I don't want anything to break off, but I think I've got a good point here if we can just maybe get that. There we go. That looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how that looks. You can really have him be like riding him like a steed. That is just a really cool look. Maybe it doesn't look quite as good as some of the other dinosaurs due to the weird proportions, but I think that works out just okay in terms of the way it's built. And yeah, overall it's just really cool to see this being scaled so well next to the characters. For believability in universe, to wrap up all of our points now, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. I definitely feel like this fits in very well with the Bionicle aesthetic. Maybe it relies a little bit too much on CCBS, which is more kind of smooth armor plating, and it could have featured a little bit more mechanical detail. But one thing I do like aesthetically speaking is that a lot of the mechanical detail, like the gears, are hidden on the underside or exoskeleton of the creature, and a lot of the more exposed outer parts are smoother, even like the Nuva chest here, which is a very smooth piece. Moving on from that though, aesthetics, I'm going to give an 8 out of 10. I think it looks really good, the color scheme is fantastic, the proportions feel a little bit off to me in terms of the very large legs compared to the much smaller body, but overall I think it's pretty good in general, and again, that color scheme is a very cool and striking one. Moving on to building techniques. Easy 10 out of 10. I love the parts usages here, and yeah, posability aside, we'll get to that. For this being a digital model, it had no right to be as stable and as good-looking physically built than it is right here. I'm usually fairly skeptical of all digital models because a lot of times they do end up to be pretty fragile and built IRL, but this is actually really well done, and despite the fact that a lot of the pieces are resin printed by me, I am not the biggest expert on resin printing, I'm still kind of just starting out, so they don't have the perfect clutch power. I did have to play around with the settings to get it just right and to make it look good. everything clips on and everything works really well in terms of keeping this model congruent with other LEGO pieces. And I think the overall parts usages here, from the Sonic armor pieces to that head piece, oh, the head is just so good, to the claws, to the very inventive usage of the Galaxy Squad wings as extra detail here, to the way the tail is done. Building techniques are just fantastic. Finally, talking about posability. Unfortunately, I do have to dock it on posability because you can't move these legs around, and it is really annoying to get it to stand up with the back Borak eyes just flopping backwards. I'll give it a 7 out of 10 because you can get it into good poses. The head in particular is really posable and easily my favorite posable thing about the model itself. It's just that the legs are a little bit of a letdown in terms of posability because I was expecting it to have a lot more friction and a lot more movement in the legs, but unfortunately you just can't really rotate this upper piece, which is just a little bit disappointing. Otherwise though, this is a phenomenal model. Major congratulations to Sonova for being a finalist in this particular contest. Well done to everybody who competed here. This is a very, very cool looking model, and I'm super happy to have finally been able to build one of Sonova's insanely good Bionicle 3D creations, finally in physical form, with hopefully many more to come if he continues to enter in the contest. I'm looking at that Merendo. I really want to build that one. So that about sums up our review of the Magna Raptor. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and bye for now.
Alright, and with that, we have summed up this Bionicle fan review of the Magna Raptor by Sonova. Let me know down in the comments below, what do you think of this model? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? And what modifications might you make to its design? I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you all so much for tuning in to another episode of Bionicle fan reviews. And of course, do let me know in the comments as well, what do you want to see me review that I haven't reviewed already for the fan reviews? I do have more Dark Hunters and Rahi on the way. I promise they are coming. I know that it's been probably over a year now since the last time I did one. They're all in the backlog. I have a lot of them built, but I think that we tried to space them out a little bit more. So once the dinosaurs are through, there definitely will be more of a return to these standard fan reviews. And so, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to like and subscribe for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. And tune into us on Twitch if you want to see LEGO building live streams, stuff like setting up my city live, or even just playing LEGO video games. Lots of fun stuff like that, so come join us there, linked in the description below as well. Thank you all so much for tuning into Duck Bricks. I'll see you again soon, and bye for now.